Good evening, friends. Thank you, and welcome. It's a privilege to welcome you here and to see such a large crowd this evening. I'm Henry Bechtel, president of Conrad Grable University College, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the 11th annual Bechtel Lectures in Anabaptist Mennonite Studies. This year promises to be another interesting, exciting, provocative, challenging journey hosted by and led by our Bechtel lecture. Each year, those of you who've been here regularly will recall that we've taken on a journey of exploration, of discovery that challenges and informs and inspires us. Part of the role of this college, of Conrad Grable, as an academic institution is to collect and preserve, to report, to research, report on, and teach about the diverse, many-layered Mennonite community and that Mennonite story locally, nationally, and globally. And we seek in this way, and it's part of our mission as a college, to nurture a broader interest in, understanding of, and appreciation for the many expressions of the Anabaptist Mennonite faith and life, history, culture throughout the 5 centuries of our history, and to build bridges of understanding among that community and beyond that community in this very diverse world. Now, it's a formidable challenge, to be sure, but it's a task for which I believe Conrad Grable is ideally situated and equipped. Situated as we are on the campus of one of the most innovative universities in the country. Situated as a college of the Mennonite Church with its radical faith tradition and a global reach and impact that far outstrips its size. Equipped through the outstanding resources we have here, the faculty who research and write and teach in a wide range of disciplines, experts all in their field. And through the academic programs in which they are involved and the resources of the college in such areas as Mennonite Studies and religious studies, history, theology, sociology, Mennonite literature, and the list goes on, and includes the Mennonite Archives of Ontario, and public lectures and other events. Well, this is one such, the Bechtel Lectures. These lectures provide an additional resource to the community and to the college by bringing a variety of lectures, of resource persons here, be they academics, practitioners in their field, bringing them here on an annual basis for 2 lectures each year to help us probe and ponder and discuss questions of meaning and contemporary relevance related to our history and the issues of the day. So we're grateful to Lester Bechtel for the gift of these lectures, now in their 11th year. We are embarking again this evening on one of those journeys that probe our identity and our self-understanding. And while we won't be entering by way of technology, the technology that you see around you already, we won't be entering a time machine. I expect we will be taken in on what for many of us will be a journey into some unfamiliar places perhaps, or even uncomfortable places, both literally and figuratively. The theme of this year's lectures is, we are all treaty people. We are all treaty people. Now, I, like many of us, I suppose, learned about treaties in high school history. The dictionary defines treaty as a noun. I learned about treaties as relationships. They ordered certain understandings and relationships and defined identities. there is the rare instance when treaty is used as part of a compound word, a compound moniker, Treaty Indian. I've heard that word. I've never been called a treaty person of any kind. Now, like most of us, I've been called many things, some of which I can repeat here. As a German-speaking person born in Paraguay to Mennonite refugees from the Soviet Union who came to Canada as an immigrant, that has included terms like squarehead and DP, or displaced person, not to mention Russian Mennonite, a name that I own, been called, and haven't really winced at, though I don't quite understand why or what it means. A term that the first Mennonite immigrants from the Soviet Union who settled here in this area in the 1920s were quick and vigorous to reject and disavow. While I don't ever recall, as I suggested, being described or defined as a treaty person of any kind, never mind thinking of myself in those terms. So I'm particularly interested in what I think I'm interested in, what I'm about to discover this evening about myself and about the world in which I live. I expect it will be an interesting and informative adventure for all of us, and so I invite you to make note of your comments and questions during the lecture for the discussion period to follow. Our 2011 Bechtel lecturer is Dr. Roger Epp. Dr. Epp is founding dean of the University of Alberta's Augustana campus, a liberal arts campus of about 1,000 students in Camrose, Alberta, where he is also professor of political studies. A native of rural Saskatchewan, born in the town of Hanley, he studied at the University of Alberta and at Queen's University, and has taught at Augustana since 1990, where he's also recipient of an outstanding or distinguished teaching award. Dr. Epp is the author of, among other works, We Are All Treaty People, Prairie Essays, and co-editor of Writing Off the Rural West. He lives in Camrose with his wife, Rhonda Harder Epp, and they are parents of 2 adult children. Now, I also discovered that in 2004, Roger was inducted into the Golden Key International Honor Society. You might wonder, as I did, what on earth is that? And why have I never heard of it before? Well, I discovered through the benefits of Google that Golden Key International Honor Society is an academic honor society which recognizes and encourages scholastic achievement and excellence among college and university students from all academic disciplines worldwide. And there are currently over 2 million members. 2 million students so identified and recognized, who have been recognized at over 390 chapters at colleges and universities in more than 190 countries. Now, according to the website, although there are 20 chapters in Canada, this innovative university is not among them. That is the University of Waterloo. I don't know why. In addition to these 2 million student members, I discovered the society also has more than 20,000 honorary members, of which Dr. Epp is one. And these members are elected by local chapters in recognition of their qualities of scholarship, leadership, and service. And the list includes such notables as Roberta Bondar, Canada's first female astronaut, Bill Cosby and Dolly Parton, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, Nobel Prize laureate, august company for the Dean of Augustana, I would say. A tribute to your work and your commitment to the academy. Like his parents and grandparents, Dr. Epp has lived most of his life on Treaty 6 land. Treaty 6, it's a large swath of land stretching from central Saskatchewan, I believe, to the Alberta-British Columbia border, a distance of over 500 kilometers from east to west, probably, if my calculations are correct. That geographic space and place has rooted and informed both his life and his scholarship. Dr. Epp's current interests include rural community development, land use conflict, and settler Aboriginal relations, themes that he's addressed in his publications and about which he is a frequent media commentator and speaker. He has called the rural West his beloved country. And I quote, "This is the world in which I grew up and now teach. It is at once a familiar landscape, a history, an economy, a culture, a set of communities encountered at close range and sometimes through enduring friendships. This is the beloved country to which I feel a sense of obligation and critical affection, and with whose people I have learned to think with, not just for, about what it means to live well here." Dr. Epp, welcome to Conrad Grebel University College. We look forward to your presentation this evening entitled, "What is the Settler Problem?"
Thank you, Henry. I'm not sure why you bothered to ask speakers for bios anymore. You just go to Google and you find out things that I didn't even know. So I'm going to have to check that stuff out. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I've had a warm welcome today, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Chance to be in front of people who haven't heard me speak too many times, so this is always a good thing. And I also want to congratulate Conrad Grable and all of you who are here. It's an important thing, but not an easy thing, for institutions of higher education to let down the drawbridge and invite, in a non-intimidating way, invite members of their supporting communities in. And you should be really pleased by well, I'm sure it's because there's a long tradition of doing that here, and that's really important. And it was a pleasure today to meet Lester Bechtel, who is part of that tradition of taking down the drawbridges by sponsoring these lectures. So it's an honor for me to be here. Now, I come with a couple of handicaps. My wife is not here, so there's not the familiar person somewhere in the back of the room saying, "It's time to wind it up." I'll acknowledge that. And I'm also here, people on my home campus where I'm identified as part of the neo-Luddite fringe will, one or two of them know that I actually prepared a small number of PowerPoint slides. So this is not something I regularly do. So I'm hoping that all will go smoothly, but this is what's new about today. So let me move right into this first lecture. It's an interesting challenge, actually. The first time I've done two lectures and had to think about how to say something across two lectures, which I guess is my way of saying I'm sure all the really good stuff is in lecture 2. Take that as advertising. Tonight I want to talk about what I call the settler problem. In the cold, wintry, very cold this year, wintry weeks leading up to tonight, with this lecture very much, at least back of mind, I took part in 2 sacred, solemn gatherings. One of them I will describe in detail tomorrow. It was a first ever round dance on our campus. The other was my uncle's funeral in Saskatchewan. This might be a site that some of you might vaguely know because maybe you've been there. My uncle was lowered to sleep, as we say, with his ancestors in the historic cemetery at Eigenheim, the oldest continuing Mennonite congregation in the old Canadian Northwest. My father is buried there too, and that's our family actually, huddled around my father's grave, which we did at -30 on that morning in January. It is sacred ground. It is our family's compass point, even though we don't live there anymore. Eigenheim, literally a home of one's own, was the name given to this district in which my paternal ancestors were among the first settlers in the 1890s. They came from Russia. They accepted the geographic order of the government's square survey grid, more isolating than the old country villages. But they filled its spaces with a church, with schools, with outlandish names like Friedensfeld and Hoffnungsort, German names filled with desire, grandiose desire and longing. My grandfather was among the very first babies born in that community. He might have been the oldest, but I'm not going to make that claim because someone here probably knows someone who might. You'll want to test that one. His grandmother, Judith Epp, who was the matriarch of our family in North America, is buried there. I think she was among the very first to be buried in that cemetery. A handsome column, an unusual vertical column, still rises straight above the snow, marking her grave. The historian of the Canadian West, Francis Swarupa, in a new book called Storied Landscapes, describes the significance for settlers of such what she calls places for the dead, where she says the certainty that they would rest apart from their ancestors, their bones being literally part of a new land, drove home the finality of their decision to uproot and relocate. The settlers' cemeteries, their churches, schools, and halls, the names they gave them, claimed and defined and storied the landscape in familiar terms. But she also notes in a gentle way, the newcomers often failed to realize that Western landforms had Aboriginal names that told stories, explained the universe, and oriented people's travels. This displacement of names, she says, was not so much a matter of conquest as it was limited contact, the sense of absence. In fact, she writes, the word settlers used to describe the West, empty, virgin, alien, unpeopled, ignored the indigenous presence as they set about claiming this space as their own. This is also the point with which Jacqueline Baker begins her very interesting novel called The Horseman's Graves, set in a German Catholic immigrant community tucked up against Saskatchewan's Great Sand Hills. And now you can say you've learned two things tonight. Saskatchewan has great hills, probably didn't know that, and a desert. The narrator, right on the first page, describes this, or observes that settlers already burdened by the pasts of another country, could not perceive the ghosts that had walked and still walked those nearby hills. So for ghosts, think stories. The formative stories, sometimes the unspoken stories that tell us who we are, who is we, who is not we, what to fear, and so on. From Eigenheim, it is less than 20 miles due north to Fort Carlton, the Hudson's Bay Company provisioning post on the North Saskatchewan River, where in 1876, just 18 years before the Epp family showed up in Eigenheim, where Treaty 6 was negotiated and signed in the presence of Cree lodges. Later in that same year, there was a second signing at Fort Pitt, further upstream, with only a few holdouts. And the landmass of Treaty 6, as mentioned, stretches across Alberta and Saskatchewan. Huge. Just to help you get your geographic bearings. It was at Fort Carlton in 1885 that the Cree leader Big Bear, one of those earlier holdouts, surrendered voluntarily to the authorities who had been looking far and wide for him, and he just showed up and said, "Here I am," because they held him responsible for some of the scattered Métis and Cree uprisings in that year. And his show trial and his imprisonment quickly ensued. From Eigenheim, in 1897, it was, I understand, possible to hear the cannon fire from the Poplar Bluff near Batoche and One Arrow across the river to the east, where the alleged cattle thief Almighty Voice was captured to be hung at Duck Lake. His story was at once the story of hunger and daring and the story of settler fears. I think there were at least a couple of Mennonites from Eigenheim who somehow were at least observing the siege of Almighty Voice. From Eigenheim, it was and still is about 12 kilometers to the corner of the closest reserve set aside for the Willow Cree people, Beardy's First Nation. But it may have been too far in this case to hear the small dramas that preceded the departure of generations of Cree children for residential school, most likely at Duck Lake. The Mennonite settlers had troubles enough of their own. Walter Clawson, whose name will be familiar to people in this room, in a very good history of Eigenheim, writes that the Cree were, these are his words, on the fringes of our life and consciousness. Even though they are, he said, our neighbors, present tense. Contact was incidental. Peddling firewood, hiring out at harvest time. The two communities, he wrote, have lived side by side for a century, but no lasting bonds have been developed between them to this day. His observation can be read as an indictment, softened just enough to fit into a congregational history without the committee getting nervous about it, or as regret, or as a more neutral statement of the obvious, the near solitude so characteristic of newcomer Aboriginal relations across North America. Side by side, but not more than that. I have a more dramatic story of that kind to tell in my family history. And it's one I began to tell in an essay whose first version was published in the Conrad Grable Review. It was my first attempt at anything called literary nonfiction. I'm a political scientist by training, and none of what I do, none of what I was trained to do looked like literary nonfiction. So I was grateful that someone thought this was worth publishing. It was an essay called Oklahoma. And the story began with two grandmothers, each remembered in the intimacy of long unbraided hair. One was Scott Momaday's grandmother. Scott Momaday, in his account of the Kiowa people in southwestern Oklahoma in a book called The Way to Rainy Mountain. And the other was my grandmother, as I remembered her, missing Oklahoma. There we were in Saskatchewan, and my grandmother would sing America the Beautiful which gets more interesting when I tell you a little bit more of the story. And missing Oklahoma, where she had been a girl. The place that she and my maternal ancestors had left in 1918 and 1919 for Eigenheim during wartime, amid all of the local nativism that erupted against German-speaking Mennonite pacifists, against Aboriginal peoples, against socialists, against the whole lot of them. It was time to clean house in Oklahoma. My family had settled in Washita County, if settled is the right word for it, in the 1890s land rush that followed the taking back of tribal lands that had been allocated to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho in that part of the world. All of that in the name of civilization, progress, and individuality. And it was here that my great-grandfather, Jacob Clawson, came with his brother, lived with his animals in a sod shack, built a successful farm, rented land from the Indians, he said, which is as close as he comes in his extensive diaries to acknowledging the people who lived beside him. Others I have read since then, not his diaries, refer to the drumming that they heard every night up from the river. But back to that. It was in this place that not only did he build a farm, but he grieved a wife, an infant daughter, a son crushed beneath the grain wagon that he was driving, all of them buried under the short cedars at the cemetery of the Herald Mennonite Church, where he was also an ordained minister, until the weight of all the things I just mentioned meant that he could not speak anymore. And he grieved not least to leave this place, to follow his sons to Canada. And he said at the time that the leaving was so hard that he knew he would be a stranger wherever he went, and that nothing in his subsequent experience had shaken that sense of being a stranger. Had I not lived the most beautiful part of my life on this little piece of ground. And all of this in the same very compact part of the world into which the Cheyenne had been compressed after a series of post-treaty brutalities, including the one at Sand Creek in eastern Colorado, inflicted by a citizen militia in 1864, and then the surprise attack by Custer's 7th Cavalry on the so-called Battle of Washita, where the Cheyenne leader, designated as a peace chief, his anglicized name is Black Kettle, was killed. This after he had been to Washington, received the flag, received Lincoln's Medal, and he was among those killed. But I did not, so all of this had been pieced together over a couple of decades for me, bits of story. But I did not know how small and compact that world was, or why I couldn't let go of these bits of story, these parallel stories of home and displacement, until our family drove to southwestern Oklahoma, which, if you are following the western Dakotas and through that part of Kansas, means that you haven't had a good cup of coffee for several days by the time you arrive. A slight ad hominem comment. In the county museum at Cordell, just north of the courthouse, where a hostile judge routinely sent Mennonite boys to military prison in 1917, like my grandfather's cousin, who was shipped home in a box eventually, dead in a military uniform from Fort Leavenworth, where he had died. It was in that museum that I found a Washita County map dated 1913. It was full of surprises. Within 2 or 3 miles of the river, the map is a checkerboard of Mennonite and Cheyenne names. Among the latter, there is a familiar name. White Buffalo Woman was a girl in 1868 when the 7th Cavalry attacked the Cheyenne lodges along the river. Her description of it is an important part of the oral history of that event. And in 1913, though I have not been able to verify beyond all historians' doubt that it is the same person, White Buffalo Woman is listed as the owner of 2 80-acre pieces of land. One of them is alongside the river. The other borders Jacob Clawson's farm. So one of the many themes at work in the essay, at that moment it became clear that it was not finished yet. And that the story of my family in North America could not and should never be disentangled from the story of the Cheyenne, the story of the Cree. Which is why I say that I am a product of Indian policy on both sides of the 49th parallel, which is a geographic marker that I know makes more sense where I live than here, and why I say that I am a treaty person, as has been mentioned. Like my grandparents, my parents, I have lived most of my life on Treaty 6 land in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And for reasons I can't explain, it's been given to me to wonder what that means, what obligations it entails as the descendant of settlers, what sort of thinking and acting it entails. So in my lectures tonight and tomorrow, I want to do some of that thinking with you. When I was invited by Henry to deliver these lectures, he encouraged me to speak to issues of Aboriginal settler relations out of the work I'd done, but in a way that was mindful of the fact that in this part of the world there are some contemporary local conflicts, especially along that 6-mile strip of the Grand River. So in approaching this subject, I think I would say that it's necessary for me to be tentative but not timid, if that makes sense. Maybe humble is a better word than tentative. For one thing, I am out of place in southern Ontario. I know what I've read, but that's the extent. I know what I've read about Caledonia, about the Haldimand Tract, about the Two-Row Wampum, but I won't claim any expertise. And for another, I am acutely aware that the very mention of those words, or the words, or words like Aboriginal, or treaty, or land claims, will evoke weariness in people, or anger, or guilt in any Canadian audience. It's hard to say something new, much less something encouraging about those themes. Which is why I would say it's always important for me to start personally, by locating myself, by locating my inquiry in terms of my own place and story. It's easy to wander into stories that aren't your own to tell, and this is where the tentativity and the humility have to enter in. I do not want to participate in the kind of patronizing talk that has offered in many ways for several generations to solve what the poet bureaucrat Duncan Campbell Scott, when he was the Deputy Superintendent General for Indian Affairs in this country in 1920, called the Indian problem. Park that for a thought, or for a second. I do want to say a preliminary word about titles and the limits and imperfections of language. This is the tentative part of the talk. These lectures borrow their title from my book of prairie essays. I wasn't sure it was the right title for the book. I wasn't imaginative enough to think of another title for the essay, or for the talks. But perhaps I hadn't finished wringing all the provocation out of that title yet. So I'm happy to use it. Even as the language, "we are all treaty people," has become shockingly familiar. The book was about to go to press and my son calls and says, "Dad, you know your title is on a billboard in Winnipeg?" Thanks. I'll mention that to the marketing folks. It's become a slogan or a catchphrase for the work of the Treaty Land Commission in Saskatchewan, I think it was even the banner under which Mennonite Church Manitoba gathered for a consultation some years ago. So I should be happy that I'm part of the trend. I'm aware that even that phrase can be exclusive, even as it means to be inclusive. My Métis friends would say, where do we fit? We were left out. We were deliberately excluded from the treaty-making process. Are we treaty people? Or there is the argument that I have heard from Cree elders that First Nations people have a relationship with the Crown, as they understand it, not with their neighbors. Why are their neighbors treaty people? So we've had this conversation. I will say that I first heard that phrase about 15 years ago in a classroom, which is where all good ideas come from a middle-aged Aboriginal woman student who then declared that if we live in this part of the world where we were living and studying, we exercise a treaty right every day. Know it or not, we are all treaty people. She meant it as something other than a statement of solidarity, which historically has been in short supply. It is instead the right that we exercise every day by living where we do. It is the history in which we are entangled, though not, of course, in the same way or with the same need to remember it. It is a history filled with asymmetries, but it is a shared history, an entanglement all the same. So if we are all treaty people, what is my work, our work, to do? So I have proposed, and will do so tonight again, that as settlers we need to reverse Duncan Campbell Scott's powerful act of verbal displacement and instead ask, what is the settler problem? Not what is the Indian problem. What is the settler problem? In other words, the subject under scrutiny becomes ourselves. It is no longer about what they want, land, recognition, compensation, and therefore about what we can live with. Instead, it is about our own mentalities, our own histories of moral indifference, our own historical ignorance, all those things that stand in the way of a different relationship, especially in places where they are most urgently needed. It's about the stories we choose to tell ourselves, and maybe it is also about the stories we choose to hear. It is about the emotions close to the surface, and why. In her new book called Unsettling the Settler Within, Paulette Regan takes up the same settler problem. She writes, "The singular focus on the other blinds us from seeing how settler history, myth, and identity have shaped and continue to shape our attitudes in highly problematic ways. It prevents us from acknowledging our need to decolonize." Paulette Regan is Director of Research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was established by the courts as part of the residential schools settlement. Safe to say the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, or its existence is unknown to most Canadians. I won't test this room. Its work in hearing and archiving the stories of residential school survivors, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, may have gained profile, at least momentarily, because of the Prime Minister's apology in 2008 on behalf of all Canadians, but it is still work done in obscurity. Now, I should say that that apology, I don't know if you remember it, was surprisingly frank and unequivocal. And for me, the best test of that was to judge from the reactions of Aboriginal people I knew, who did experience it as genuine and powerful. and maybe as liberating in a certain way, giving permission to talk about what had happened. That apology said that the burden of what survivors had experienced, above all the state-sponsored, church-delivered attempt to strip people of language and culture by taking them out of their communities as children, that burden needed to be borne by the government and the people of Canada. And the attitudes that had inspired that system, it had to be said, had no place in contemporary Canada. Frank and unequivocal. Regan's point, though, is that the apology did little to transform the settler or reverse the rush to put the past behind us. How is it, she asks, that we know nothing about this history, even though the last generations of survivors still live among us and some of the schools still stand? I actually taught in one. I delivered a for credit course at a tribal college once and was shown where the peepholes were, where the nuns, because it was a Catholic school, would spy on the students, and told some other stories about what had happened there. How will Canadians, Regan asks, who have so selectively forgotten this sad chapter in our history now undertake to remember it? She insists that we regard the apology not as a closing, but as an opening for Canadians to rethink our past and its implications for our present and future generations. So the settler problem in this formulation shows itself as what another scholar, Keavy Martin, calls a longing for oblivion, for the luxury of forgetting, for the absolution of amnesia, and as a fixation on resolution. All this is true, I think, and the consequence of that is that our own past is never fully available to us. It's the place you are afraid to go. We are afraid of it, or at least afraid of the contention that comes with it. But we haven't yet gone deep enough into our inquiry, I think, and we are unlikely to have moved those who are most likely to resist. I think it is natural enough that outcomes should be framed in terms of settlement when so much of Aboriginal settler relations are now, by political default, mediated through the courts. Courts speak the language of settlement, final judgment. And I would argue as well that the residential school story has elicited a certain degree of empathy among Canadians, enough for the current government to have said what it said. It's something Canadians got, in retrospect, at least for a little while. The tougher issue is still land, which moves us maybe further, deeper into this inquiry. The longing for closure, the willful amnesia, all of that is embedded more deeply in the mythology of terra nullius, no one's land, whose grip on the colonial imagination was renewed in every generation, and whose grip actually, I think, tightened the more people were removed in time and in space from those first encounters, if anything. In the beginning, wrote the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, all the world was America. In the beginning, all the world was America. In that crude political creation myth of his, the case for limited government, for private property, rested on a social contract that had delivered us from a state of nature, a primitive state, that was variously brutal or insecure or merely inconvenient because it rendered us all judges in our own case. So America signified the world before government and property, a primitive state. It didn't matter that Locke's America bore no relation to the real America he never visited. It was a philosopher's thought experiment, a simple developmental anthropology, a single story into which all peoples were fitted. And in that story, the justification for property was one's efficient use of it, which meant cultivation, so that God's creation, which was given to humankind in common, could, through human labor and appropriation and trade, meet human need most abundantly. That was the justification for property. And you can trace a fairly direct line from this state of nature social contract mythology to the arguments that got made in 18th century international law, namely that the wandering tribes, I'm using the language of the day, the wandering tribes who roamed North America's vast tracts of land, more than they could occupy or use themselves, had no right to keep it to themselves. They could be rightly confined to smaller tracts, and the rest of it made available to people who would use it efficiently. This is an intellectual argument that is still made. If you've ever read Tom Flanagan's book, First Nations, Second Thoughts, you would have a classic paradigm, liberal, social contractarian argument, all the same language. His argument is that the march of civilization has two characteristics. One is the rule of organized states over stateless societies and peoples, and the other is the displacement of hunter-gatherers by cultivators. The last act of this great civilizational drama, he writes, is the spread of agriculture around the world. Now, this is St. Patrick's Day, and I know we're here and not, I don't know, at St. Jerome's. Now you're going to wonder what I'm saying after this. The first planters in the Americas were not, in fact, Europeans. Any historian knows this. And I was thinking Irish because we owe it to the indigenous peoples of what is now Peru. We owe the potato to them and their careful genetic work with varieties of potato, because without it we wouldn't be eating the potato. And so they gave it to us, not the Irish, and there are other stories we could tell along the same lines. But the settler mythology is more powerful and more attractive than any disruption an historian could throw into the mix. It has continued to offer people a sacrament of innocence, a fresh start, a justification for hard work. In Canada, in South Africa, in Israel, wherever people say there was nothing here when we came, and we made something of it. I've never heard that so clearly as I have in a church, more than once. There was nothing here when we came. Very defensively offered, actually. There was nothing here when we came, and we've made something of it. The Mennonite story from the 16th century onward is one of migrant peoples who fitted uneasily into the religious and the geopolitical imperatives of early modern Europe, but whose resettlement in Russia, in North America, often followed closely on the dispossession of other people. This is not new. But especially in the so-called New World, The bonus was that they could share in the nation-building project, not be excluded by it. And the nation-building project was the act of taking possession of this place, cultivating it. This was the national project. If you were a Westerner, it's hard to remember that the national project was a federal plot intended to turn the West into an export grain-growing region. That was the national policy around which the railroad system and everything else was developed. And my ancestors could fit into the national project. They were not outsiders. They could be insiders. Add to that the familiar appropriation of the biblical story of chosenness, exile, and deliverance. The people of God never identify with the foot soldiers of Assyrian or Babylonian colonization. No, they are those who take possession of the land that is promised or restored to them. The self-identification is easy and obvious. On the Sunday that our family worshiped at the Herald Mennonite Church in Washita County, Oklahoma, and we did, and I was wearing shorts, and my mother's second cousin Robert, who drove us around that afternoon in a big old Lincoln with air conditioning that didn't work and windows rolled down, looked at me and this Stetson on the dash and said, "Do you always go to church like that?" At which point we got on well. At that church, beside which the cemetery holds the grave of my great-grandmother, the preacher's text that morning was on this very thing. It was from the book of Joshua, and it was about the land that would be delivered to those taken out of oppression in Egypt, the land that had been promised. There was no one here when we came, and by hard work we've made something of it. That's the primal spirit of North America. As George Grant once told us, that's the settler problem. So I've probably said just about enough for one night, because some of you are ready to test me on this. This first lecture was meant in turn to situate myself in a particular way, because I think that's important to do. But also, I hope to provoke in more general terms. My orientation is always to go back, to retrieve, to recollect, to entangle the past. In the second lecture, I want to shift more toward the contemporary, not to put the past behind us, since the past is never really past, but to think how we can imagine out of it a different future, a different reconciliation than simple forgetting. Because if you notice, the work of forgetting falls mostly to Aboriginal people. In closing, I want to step back from grand abstract claims and simple oppositions, settler and Aboriginal, ancient and modern. The resources we will need are small and surprising ones. They are stories and actions. It may help us to know that the young almighty voice, let's see if I can retrieve him here, not only risked his life in about I'm not sure what the year was, not only risked his life to cross the South Saskatchewan River at ice breakup in the spring, once and then back, to bring food to a desperately poor Mennonite widow, Amelia Wheeler, and her children on a homestead far outside of her community, but also that she fed him while he was a fugitive when he would visit her cabin. It may help us to remember similar acts of reciprocity. The berries that Mennonite settlers in Manitoba learned to eat because someone showed them they could. Similar acts of reciprocity along the Grand River between the Six Nations people, the Mennonite settlers, each displaced by war. And it may help you to know how unremarked it was. That among the grandsons who carried my uncle's coffin from the hearse to the grave on that bitterly cold January morning at the Eigenheim Cemetery, 3 of them were Aboriginal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Catch your breath for a moment and then identify some comments or questions that you'd like to address to Dr. Epp or to the audience this evening. Yes, sir.
I wonder if Dr. Epp would be brave enough to offer a solution.
You have to come tomorrow. And I'm still not going to completely satisfy you because I don't, well, we'll see. We'll see what we do. You come tomorrow.
I will be here.
And you can be first up to the question period.
Stand up and ask you again.
Yes, please.
Groups of people and nations often have a sense of their territory, their boundaries. They define themselves that way. Were there a variety of traditions here in North America previous to the separation, which as peoples who were here moved in relation to each other, that they understood territory, boundary, or interaction with those? Were those more amorphous? How did they work?
The question was whether, prior to European arrival here, what sense of territory and boundaries would there have been? The short answer is yes. I think historians have done lots of work on this, in the sense of even attributing on the plains a sense of very active herd management. And grazing management, sometimes with the buffalo. But the part of the world where I live, there is, well, just south of me is the Battle River, which was the boundary, not always, but after the Cree had moved out of the forests and onto the plains, it became the boundary line between the Cree and the Blackfoot people. So certainly that sense of boundary, but also not a sense of property, but maybe what I would say, the notion of private property was one that, that early modern European peoples had to learn to adopt too. Some people would say we were colonized first, that where you had notions of a commons, that would be subject to multiple uses by multiple peoples for multiple purposes. That was displaced by a tighter notion of property as exclusive domain. So that was a revolution in Europe before it became a model for export. So that sense of the commons, but a commons not meaning that there aren't understood ways of who has access, who makes claims. I think there's lots of evidence about that.
I think one of your descriptions of Big Bear was he was hungry, he was a cow thief.
That was Almighty Voice.
Was there, explain like the herds, what are the herds and where did they go and how are these people so hungry?
By the 1870s, the buffalo had mostly been hunted into oblivion. So that was part of it, and part of the, and whether, there's a certain historical line of argument that says some of that was deliberate. It was intended to force people into a treaty-making situation. Yeah, I think there were fires set in certain places, especially along the border. But by the 1870s and especially the 1880s, there was lots of hunger and privation on the Canadian plains. And it sometimes induced bands and their leadership to accept treaty where otherwise they would have been inclined to resist. And it was partly that caused some of the acts of disruption that followed. Some of it was, I would say, young men being stripped in a very short time of the kind of role that they had imagined for themselves. But some of it was sheer hunger. And the treaties had spoken to that, and the understanding around the treaties was that they were also about a kind of care in tough times that would be exercised. And so that was the sense of disappointment around the treaties.
One of your comments mentioned the loss of memory, and that certainly would be true for Mennonites, to forget very quickly. Are there any memories among the Cree? I had to think of it when you mentioned Almighty Voice and this Mrs. Wheeler. Are there any memories among the Cree that remember a time of coexistence with the Mennonites, kind of mutual reciprocity and mutual dependency and so on? Is there anything there, even in the oral histories and memories?
That would be a really interesting thing to look into. There wouldn't have been many touch points, but the Eigenheim area would have been one of them. And I think some of that incidental contact, say the peddling of firewood or fish, or the harvest hiring out, would have constituted some of that contact at an earlier point. But I know this from the Mennonite side of the historical record. Certainly, if one of the stores Mennonites would go to from that area was Duck Lake, they would encounter Indian people along the way. But I'm not aware of oral histories that trace that. That would be interesting. And whether, yeah, just what the impressions were. Don't know.
I'm curious whether you've thought about an earlier layer of perhaps your own family background of Mennonites in Russia or Ukraine and the Khortytsa Island. Like, I recently was there and just looking at the museum that talks all about the Cossack people. And realizing that this place that I've always envisioned as the Mennonite homeland, there's a tiny little display case about Mennonites, but really it's a Cossack place. And that it was also very similar to this. It wasn't an empty place. But there were no treaties there. It was just a big trail and a military victory that left that land open. Have you thought about it's kind of ironic for the Mennonite people to have done that. Yeah.
Ironic or just persistent. And there were points in the history where Mennonite peoples who felt like they were being pressed to the edge of their existence in wherever, on the list of places to go would have been South Africa, well, at one point Mississippi looked like it was high on the list for some people. That would have been interesting. I won't get into the tangled tale of my family history, except to say that some of my maternal ancestors were on the trek to Central Asia. And my great-grandfather would have been baptized as an adolescent not far from present-day Afghanistan. where they went to to get away from everything, get away from military service. Some of them, yes, await the second coming, but soon found that there was lawlessness and banditry and strange tribes, and so they longed for the order of some state that would take them in again, which is how they ended up in the middle of the United States. So no, it is an interesting pattern, and I should say, and I'll say again tomorrow, that, and this is a saying that I've learned from, I haven't learned it well if I can't name the tradition now, but a Native American tradition, that one ought not to defecate in the nest of one's ancestors. And I take that seriously and respectfully, but it's given to us, I think, then to think about that pattern and how it is that being so desperate for deliverance, we become part of the problem in the next place, and someone else's tool.
Question here, over there.
I was wondering if you find in Western Canada the same, I suppose the same resistance to land claims of being, well, that's old and people should have walked away from that by now. I mean, part of the problem in Caledonia seems to be that well, we don't really want to acknowledge that there's a land claim there because we want to build houses where we want to build houses. And it's inconvenient that these people don't think that.
And haven't we dealt with all of that? Who are people to keep bringing the past back?
Well, and to expect us to stand by our word. If we said this was yours, but now we don't want it to be so we'll revisit it at our convenience.
So the question is the same.
The same Europeanization of systems. I mean, that's a very European thing to say. As Africa was colonized, as many places were, it doesn't matter what your tradition is, because this is how we see the way to do things, and therefore that's the right way to do things.
There is a very active oral history around the treaty making that presents a very different understanding of what was recorded in writing at the time. And it very much speaks in almost every case, Treaty 6, Treaty 7 with some slight variations, to a fundamental concept of sharing. What we're doing is sharing. And there's a reciprocity there. We are inviting people to live on this land. The Crown has obliged itself to fulfill certain things for us. I resist the notion that people, even good Mennonite people, I think, are prone to want to let stand, which is that the treaties were simply a kind of land swindle of naive peoples, and then the door slams shut, but the deal's done and the deal's a deal. That's right. Because I think there was active negotiation with limits, and some of the limits were the hunger of people. And so what kind of leadership is responsible leadership? But the provision in the numbered treaties for agricultural implements and for education, those demands came from Aboriginal leadership. And for a while, it was as historians like Sarah Carter have shown, it was absolutely, well, there was no doubt that Indian people could farm. And in the early days of settlement, part of the problem was that the new settlers didn't like the competition. And so subsequent Indian Acts started to limit the ability of Indian people to market their farm produce off reserve, wasn't like they couldn't farm or weren't interested. Same way with education. They didn't ask for the residential school system. They asked for education as a transitional matter. So some of the oral history is actually very good about how that process was understood. But to go back to your starting premise, yes, that treaty story is as contentious and let's just stuff it back into the ground in Western Canada as it would be, I think, here.
A couple of questions back there.
So, I mean, I guess every nation or like a country has its own creation myth, and how we, I guess, we sort of teach the preschoolers our own creation myth. I mean, that's how we condition them. And perhaps I think part of how we begin to change is to change how we change the sort of stories that we can tell, like about how we were created and how we came to be. And I mean, that's how it begins with teaching the conditioning the new citizens different view of how our history was.
So the point, as much as a question, is that if every nation has a kind of creation myth, then let's change the myth, especially with school kids and with new immigrants. I think things are better on both those fronts, at least in a documentary way. The curricular materials, the materials handed out to new immigrants are no doubt more sensitive, more careful than they've ever been, or a little less bold around the old creation myth. I remember one time when my daughter was in about grade 5, and she hasn't been in grade 5 for a few years, I took my kids to a powwow one summer. And of course, the best thing of all was the giveaway dance, where all of a sudden my kids were getting tube socks just handed to them, and this was like Christmas, and it's only a tube sock. But driving away, she said, I couldn't believe there were still so many. Because in grade 5, the curriculum said these were ancient peoples. They had more or less disappeared. The last vestiges of them were still here, but this was just a matter of time. That seemed to be the message. So the actual experience of it was to confound every impression that had been given along the way in schooling, which I thought was just one of those revelatory moments and a good reason to take your kids to a powwow at least once.
Got about 4 more hands that I recognize, and I don't want to close my eyes to others, so I'll ask that we leave it at that for the evening. Starting back there.
If I heard you correctly, you mentioned that in Griffiths is where you've heard some of these no man's land claims maybe made most strongly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering whether our biblical stories of Canaan and conquest lay a foundation for this way of thinking.
Oh, exactly. Because we self-identify with the Old Testament people of Israel. Absolutely. They're the home team, and we're on the home team.
And are there ways of how do we go about rethinking?
Well, there probably are Old Testament scholars in this room who should, to whom I should defer on that question, at least on their side of the question. But I think that's absolutely part of it. That's the other narrative frame that we put on, and it's consistent with the kind of Lockean social contract frame. They work very nicely. Interestingly, in England in the 17th century, the target of Locke was all the aristocracy that had started enclosing their lands instead of letting it be used productively by people who wanted to cultivate it. Very different target, but that position gets taken up by the colonists far more enthusiastically than it ever got taken up in England.
Yes, Graham?
You read recently, I think it's David Hackett, or Fisher Hackett's book on Champlain's Dream. I get the impression that the early Quebec settlement and
implicit sharing that just seemed to work out because of maybe personalities or whatever. But have you encountered anything like that in your research in the West?
It gets harder to find the further west you go, and part of that is chronology. So on the eastern side of the country and the continent, well, the first couple of centuries of treaty making was largely about commerce, friendship, sometimes military alliance, because the British-French rivalry was something that meant that your relations had to be kept strong. There was more rough equality on the ground, we could say. To the extent that in mid to late 1700s in upstate New York, the British governor at the time always had to treat with the Six Nations on their terms, in terms of their protocols, had to keep, I think, two women on retainer and buy his beads in bulk because they were forever creating belts to describe what had happened in their transactions. So the people-to-people or community-to-community diplomacy was conducted on the basis of Six Nations protocols, rituals, very elaborate rituals that the newcomers had to learn. So there is a shift as the rough equalities shift, and as I would say, and as a certain kind of liberal individualism creeps in. Some of the worst or the most corrosive forces in the United States in the late 19th century, from the perspective of tribal peoples, were good New England liberals who thought that all of those Aboriginal peoples out west deserved the full rights of the U.S. Constitution, and broke down, well-meaning as they were, the kind of tribal identity that had a rough existence in the United States, rough legal existence. But it was well-intentioned people who thought they were doing a good turn by bringing them under the banner of the most progressive document on earth. So not just the material imbalance, it was the ideas. Whereas even the Europeans learned to play, sometimes disingenuously, sometimes not, with the kinship metaphors they encountered here. Not just the rituals, but the kinship metaphors. Sometimes Six Nations would say, don't talk about us in terms of father-children, talk about as siblings. But all of those metaphors meant obligations that sometimes the Europeans didn't even understand they were taking on. But those were the terms of the time. So there has been, yeah, you can track that shift, certainly mostly as you go west, I guess. And a different kind of relationship is going to be a local relationship, a neighborly relationship. That's also the level at which reconciliation needs to be real, or a different relationship needs to be real, and it's not just governments to do.
But that's speaking to the diverted. I rub shoulders with a lot of people that aren't interested in history and aren't interested in the future except what they see. Or discussion.
Well, no, I get your point. It's not like Alberta is a place of enlightenment in that way. Sorry, bad joke out of far from home. You might want to take the tape away on that one just in case it gets back. To some extent, yeah, what is government? To some extent, in the face of all of that, yeah, you can make an argument that it falls to government to take responsibility to live up to obligations even in the face of public opposition. And so the more resistance there might be in the general population doesn't change the fact that governments have obligations. I would just say that we should never expect that governments will do all the work. They set the stage. There are obligations in their power to deliver or respect, just that I wouldn't want them to do all the work. Sometimes in doing their work, they make it easier for the rest of us to do our work.
I think that's the point I'm making. I guess I'm disappointed that the governments don't seem to be plugging enough to get other people to sort of say, what's happening out there? So that they might question it more.
The interesting time in Canadian history recently was the period just after the Oka crisis, when maybe two things aligned. One of them was that government really did get spooked by that event, and some of the emotions underlying it. The other was a sense in the country of, I don't think there's ever been a time when, if you believe the pollsters, public support for notions of Aboriginal self-government was so high, and this was just at the time when the Constitution was or the constitutional discussions had been reopened, and the infamous Meech Lake Accord was going to deliver a little bit on that front. So maybe you say there was an opening in the early 1990s, for those reasons and no doubt some others, that might have been pursued more aggressively and wasn't, where governments quickly backtracked. Now you might say, well, how deep was that support? And it's probably true that the support increased the further away you got from communities where Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations were most real. Nonetheless, there was an opportunity that I think governments squandered. And they did establish a Royal Commission, but a Royal Commission is usually, even when it does very good work, a way to defer the problem. And no one remembers the good work that the Royal Commission did because it didn't materialize in any other way than some very good research studies.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we'll leave it at that for this evening. And thank you once again, Dr. Epp, for